Welcome to the Future of Work interview series, or the portion of the series that's about interviews here. I'm Pete Lyden. I'm the founder of Reinvent. I'm going to be driving a lot of these interviews. And with us today, we've got April Rinne, who I guess the best way to kind of categorize April, she's an expert in the future of work, also the sharing economy. She travels all over the world in consulting and speaking capacity about issues related to this. She also has a special expertise in policy and how that kind of gets applied to cities and localities in those two realms. And we're really happy to have her coming in from Portland. Hey, welcome.
Thank you, Pete. Delighted to be here.
That's great. So I gave the generic kind of explanation of how I would describe you more broad strokes, but why don't you just give a little bit of a better sense for if you're doing a talk, let's say, on the future of work, how would you be introduced, and give us a little bit of your background. That way people would say, oh, I see why she's doing that talk.
Sure, delighted to do so. And I joke sometimes that it's not necessarily that easy to describe what I do, and I'm not a teacher or an accountant. It usually takes a couple sentences, but I'm working in a space that's really rich and robust and emerging. So I think a lot of what I do is actually emergent. We're defining it as we go along. But technically, I am an independent advisor. Some people have started calling me a pathfinder, which I like a lot because I work on the one hand with startups and companies, often who are operating in new spaces or with new business models, tech enabled typically, and aren't sure what to do about policy and how to engage with government and how to engage with the broader community. And then on the other hand, I'm often working with governments and policymakers who are trying to figure out what do these new business models represent, both from a regulatory capacity, but also more and more, how can they harness these new business models to help them meet their needs? So it's a real rethinking of everything from public-private partnerships to how do we regulate things where the customers know more than the regulators do, that sort of thing. And the future of work is a very, very consistent theme in all of what I do.
Gotcha. Now, the global piece, we're going to be talking to a lot of different people in this series, but you have a particular, you move around a lot, let's just put it that way. So I saw some reference that you've been visited close to, or worked in close to 100 different countries. Give us a sense of just in the recent years, kind of the range of kind of countries that you've been in, and so and I'd like to start thinking a little bit about how the future of work actually plays out in these distinct regions.
You bet. So it is true. As of this summer, I will have been in over 100 countries. I've worked in over 50, and that includes every kind of level of economic development. So I've worked in places like Singapore and Denmark, and obviously the US and UK and Canada, and very developed economies. And I've also worked in places like Sri Lanka, Kenya, Bolivia, India, places that are either emerging economies or in some cases actually developing. So when we look at where, how is the future of work playing out, it's interesting to tee up, because on the one hand, you have very consistent similarities amongst all countries, which at a very basic level refers to everywhere in the world is trying to tackle the questions of what does the future of work look like? First and foremost, what does it mean for our workforce, our labor force, our ability to be economically and societally productive? That, of course, has knock-on effects to, well, what does that mean for education? What do we need to be teaching our youth? What about 21st century skills development? And at the other end of the demographic spectrum, or the age spectrum, what does that mean for retirement? Does that mean that we're going to be able to care for every member of our society in a way that we have been able to historically, based on this idea of a social contract? Now, the social contract itself, so some of the similarities are that we're asking the same questions. Everywhere in the world is concerned and interested about where this space is going. Now, on the other hand, though, when we start looking at, I don't want to say necessarily the differences, but the distinctions in what's happening around the world, a lot of it does hinge on level of economic development, level of technological connectivity. Something as simple as, are you a country that has typically outsourced labor, or are you the country that typically has been able to provide that outsourced labor? What's your demographics? Are you an aging country like Japan, or do you have a youth bulge like most countries in Africa? And all of these things factor into whether and how a country is able to proactively address some of what we see coming down the pike.
So let's take, I guess maybe let's take, for a lot of folks familiar with, let's say, the United States or by extension, maybe Europe, but let's just take the US. You've described to me before a kind of, I don't know if you remember this, but an evolution of how technology has essentially empowered smaller and smaller economic units down to the individual over recent decades. And I kind of wanted to take in a developed country like the United States. Could you talk through that kind of evolution of how technology has changed what people can do and businesses can do in such a relatively short time, and kind of with some thoughts on where that's going? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about here in terms of that?
Yeah, sure.
Explain, so explain it to me. I felt that was a really powerful way to kind of think about this.
Yeah, you bet. So, I like to frame it sometimes as, in recent years, go back to 1985 and you need work. So what do? Right? You get a newspaper, you apply for jobs, you mail out your resume. It's a pretty expensive and laborious process. And if you want to start your own business, you need an office, you need a desk, you need all the furniture that goes in it. Again, it's time consuming and it's resource intensive. Then you fast forward to 2004 and you need work. Like, what do? Well, the internet does exist. So you go online and you start looking at jobs boards and, maybe you still need a business suit and an office cubicle and that sort of thing, but you probably have a LinkedIn profile. You might have applied by email. Like, some of these barriers to entry are coming down. Now, if you wanted to start your own business, you could do so in garage or spare bedroom. You have access to the internet. So all you really need is access to the internet and a phone line. So for a few dollars a month, you can have a global business, or at least the emergence of that notion of a global business. And now, fast forward to today, and someone who needs work, like, what do? And honestly, like, you install an app and you log in, you create a profile, and you can almost instantly go into business. And that may mean as a member of the on-demand economy, but it really means more fundamentally, anyone in the world it's never been easier or cheaper to be your own boss, to be able to hang out a shingle, develop a kind of expertise, develop something that's of value to others, and go sell it, go produce it, go make it, and earn income for doing so. So I think that both the reality and the mechanics of applying for jobs, traditional jobs in the workforce, that has changed massively thanks to a lot of new technologies, but also the ability to be your own boss, the ability to be independent, the ability to be an entrepreneur has never been easier, cheaper, or more widely acknowledged. So that's kind of a general snapshot. Now, keep in mind, one thing that I've noted here is it's absolutely fundamentally important, essential, that you have access to the internet and digital technologies to participate in this kind of economy and this kind of workforce. So in a lot of countries in the world, we're making massive progress towards digital inclusion and digital access, but there are still a lot of people, billions of people in the world, who still lack that access. So the kind of reality I've just described is, an impossibility for them. But keep in mind, there are a lot of people in the middle who are beginning to get access to these new technologies. And so when I talk about and think about and advise on the future of work globally, I kind of have to meet the place, whether it's a city or a country, meet them where they are, but then look at how demographics are playing out and also how tech adoption is playing out. And we see enormous changes, arguably more significant changes than we would see in the US or Canada or any part of Europe, we see happening actually in some developing countries over the next 5, 10 to 20 years.
Meaning, because just basic adoption rates are now hitting more critical mass and more of the economy is shifting into the online world? Or
yeah, that there's going to be massive, we're now, in a way, in more developed economies, we're looking at the fringes of society who still need to be connected, and not insignificant, I get that, but nothing in comparison to a country like India or South Africa or Brazil or Pakistan, which have, tens, if not hundreds, and in India's case, obviously over 1 billion people, the vast majority of whom are still part of this emerging middle class, who don't necessarily, their first goal is typically to get a smartphone, or first goal is to get a mobile phone. We've reached mobile phone penetration in many of these countries, but not yet a smartphone, and certainly not yet a laptop. So it's that sort of emergence that we're looking at, where people are gradually entering the middle class. And at the same time, on the tech side, keep in mind the prices for the kinds of technologies that allow people to connect are also coming down. So yeah, it's that sort of thing. And the other overlay I would add, just very briefly, is these are also, when we look at birth rates, population growth, things like that, developing and emerging economies are where the lion's share, to put it nicely, of population growth will happen. So clearly, if you're working in a country like South Africa or anywhere on the African continent, you're looking at not only massively more connected citizens, but you're looking at a massively larger population, because the youth bulge there is of a degree that's unheard of outside of the continent.
So is it safe to say then that there's some kind of time lag, or kind of that a lot of the disruption, for example, let's say to the media, that newspapers and television getting disrupted by online media, which we've experienced profoundly here in the United States or in developed countries, that's just on a kind of a lag time, is actually moving into these other environments just by process of why wouldn't it happen there. So there's a kind of a, just, can you look at it that way, or is there some different, it's even more challenging than that, because it's not just following the playbook of what happened before, but there's even another overlay of complexity to the thing with new technologies, or how would you think about that?
It's definitely more complex, and I want to do as much as I can today to simplify our conversation, to sort of map out some of the complexities that I hope, and I say this as a general optimist about the world, but I hope that some of these complexities leave us all feeling very, very uneasy, and raise the caliber, the urgency of the conversations like this one that we need to have, and also raise the specter for who needs to be involved. So going back to, and again, I could pick any one of a number of countries, but let's just take a place like South Africa. It's an easy one for me to refer to, or India, where yes, you have a time lag, and by nature of it takes time for economies to develop as a whole, whether it's production and consumption and manufacturing, whether it's developing a system of financial markets and capital markets and taxation, like these things take time. And arguably, several hundred years after colonial powers were there, we still don't see that level of development. So there's definitely a lag, but in the face of technology, I do think it's important to keep in mind that lag is narrowing in terms of the pace of change is getting quicker and quicker. And what happens, I go to India often. I worked there for many years. Oftentimes, if I had not been to India in a year, at least in the cities, it was almost like a different place going back a year later, in terms of looking at what people were doing, how people were getting around, just the basic urban infrastructure. And yet at the same time, it's a very traditional place too, where some things, the more things change, the more they stay the same. A couple layers of complexity I want to add here, though. In most developing and emerging economies, and I guess to reference a really important concept to this conversation, is the concept of a social contract. The concept that we have in North America and in Europe, that there is a basic level of services that we want to provide for everyone in society, or that ought to be provided. So this sense of a social contract, we've been able to do that as a result of our economic progress and level of development. In many developing and emerging economies, there is a very strong social safety net in terms of like social fabric and community safety net. There are not very many social safety nets as we think of in terms of a government. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we're looking at a workforce that is by and large overwhelmingly informal. Some estimates of a place like South Africa say that 80% of the entire workforce is in the informal sector. That means they don't have a formal job or salary. They don't have benefits. There's not a social safety net for them. So the complexity plays out in that, on the one hand, technology and the ability for people to participate in some of these new forms of work actually provides us with an opportunity to formalize some of the informal sector, because at least they're showing up in a way that you can identify them. they have a profile, they have an existence, they might even start paying taxes. So that's a real big upside. Now, the downside, of course, is that there is an enormous gap between where we are today and where we need to get to be able to meet the needs of that many workers. And what I just described, be it South Africa, I think in India, in Ecuador, in Tanzania, these other places, other emerging economies, you find largely the same kind of snapshot, although there will be subtle differences locally based on culture and other sorts of dynamics.
Well, one of the things though in the developed world is because people are so used to the formal jobs infrastructure and how in the United States your healthcare is tied to it and your retirement is built into it, and Europe has its own versions of that. The independent worker future, which is the one we're exploring in this series, is foreign, or it's new, or it's kind of gaining traction. It's maybe up to a third of, let's say, American workers are starting to touch into that space. So for us, it's actually pulled into a new space. But weirdly, what you're saying is in these other countries, that is the norm, the independent worker contracted thing.
Exactly, very much.
And so in a weird way, maybe they're better positioned, or do you think, maybe it's a question,
yeah,
do you think in weird way they're better positioned to kind of work with that world? Because in anything, it's firming up a thing that they're pretty much used to, as opposed to transitioning from this more secure space.
Yeah, no, and this is the kind of idea that I wanted to be able to bounce around today, both the complexities, but also kind of some of the ironies, if you will. So yes, they're full of independent workers, but they're seen often as operating in what we would term an informal economy. In many places, the government has no expectation that they'll ever pay tax, and they don't pay tax because most of them, by and large, tend to be on the lower end income. So it's very rare, for example, that you would find in an emerging economy to find a white collar worker. They're likely going to be working at an organization, and they're going to have a job with, some kind of benefits, maybe not what we're accustomed to in the US or Europe, but some kind of benefits. The challenge that we face, so yes, this is not a new concept, and I love that because it's one that, they're very quick to acknowledge, oh yeah, we get that. That's kind of the backbone of our country. But there's never been much of an acknowledgement or a capacity to build social safety nets around that. So there's still very much a disadvantage of that kind of work. And secondly, in some countries, to varying degrees, there is actually still a stigma around saying that you're self-employed or that you're an independent worker. Depending on the country, depending on the culture, in some places that's just considered to be a nice way of saying you're unemployed, but it sounds better. And, there's this sense of needing to do a little bit of, it's more of a mindset and psychology and culture that it's not, in a lot of places around the world, entrepreneurs are happy to be entrepreneurs. But for a lot of people, particularly if no one in their family has ever actually had a job, if they've all typically been independent workers in the informal economy, there's actually a strong societal push to go get a job. Even if it's a job that you don't like, even if it's a job that doesn't pay very well, it's still a job. And so going back to what you were saying earlier about this lag, I feel like depending on where we go in the world, you have a series of conversations playing out, many of which resemble very closely what we see in the US and Europe, and many of which actually have a significant time lag, where it's like they've been operating independently for so long without as widespread of a jobs and employment and social safety net structure as we've become used to. And, one of the questions I have is whether or not certain places in the world will potentially just skip that and go from an independent informal economy to an independent worker-powered economy that's simply digital and a bit more, flexible, adaptable. It's certainly more efficient. But nonetheless, in the midst of all of that, I still would like to see social safety nets that are responsible and practical and reasonable, that provide for workers, of all stripes in all countries.
I love that. So basically, kind of like we saw, in these developing countries, the same thing. Instead of having to lay down the telephone lines and, all the different old school kind of ways that we developed over the decades, they just jumped right into, leapfrogged into mobile phones. it's possible what you're saying, although not clear how it would play out, that there'd be some kind of leapfrogging in the model that they'd adapt much quicker to this new kind of world, frankly, than a lot of than the entangled folks in the developed countries, including the United States here, who are having a hard time wrapping their head around. Because, like you mentioned, I mean, the stigma that you talked about in the developed world, I think it's safe to say that a similar thing goes on in the developed world, like the United States, don't you think?
Mhm. It does. I would say it's probably, I think as we see the, at least to some degree, the mainstreaming, or at least the data around independent workers. And it's quite common these days that everyone, somebody, if you're not an independent worker, somebody who is,
Yeah.
the diversity, and that they can be very, very successful as well. So when you see that success, there tends to be a bit less of the stigma.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back just to add one layer of complexity, which I think will make sense to bolt onto this,
Mm-hmm.
around the ability to leapfrog. And prior to the work that I'm doing now, I've spent most of my career actually in emerging and developing economies. And I was at the 50-yard line when mobile banking came along, right? So we went from having brick and mortar banks all the way to, we don't need brick and mortar banks, but over 50% of all of the GDP of Kenya, for example, now is transferred through mobile phones. It's not transferred through a bank. It's not transferred through brick and mortar. So we've seen that leapfrogging with regards to banking and financial services in particular. Obviously, we're talking about something related to human labor, which is a much more nuanced, I think, by its nature, complex subject. But the other thing I want to bring about, and this is again where I don't have the answer, but you really start to look at the tensions of what's going on, is that think about the fact that for the last many decades, we've been outsourcing labor. And we've also been, as companies, particularly multinationals, expand, they've been outsourcing labor, but also building factories in other plants, right? In other countries. And so you think about simply the retail clothing industry. And they've now got most of their production in places like Vietnam and Thailand and et cetera, et cetera. And there have been issues around labor practices and all of that. So not a pretty picture necessarily. Now, think about something like on-demand custom clothing that you can design, create, and 3D print. Or think about any widget that used to be produced in some other country, and now we will be able to print it, create it with a 3D printer. So all of a sudden, all of those people that you are employing, where do they go? What do they do? But in this weird way, even more importantly, from my perspective, think about the skills that we used to transfer. Think about the transfer of information and expertise that multinationals were able to bring to local communities. So if you were somebody in Bangladesh, or if you were somebody in Ethiopia, this is how you actually got a lot of information flow, skills building, and talent flow. And so if we start moving to both automation, but also Internet of Things and so on and so forth, if you're in this developing country context that typically has been a recipient of infrastructure and know-how, now what do you do? And so I just want to put that out there because it's a really tricky question. Now, on the one hand, at the same time, it's never been easier to learn stuff online. So it sort of underscores the importance of having digital inclusion as part of any government strategy and as part of any education strategy. But that ability to be an entrepreneur locally, I believe, will depend more and more on whether and how local digital economy ecosystems can develop.
Interesting. So while Trump and others are drumming up, oh my God, we need to bring the jobs back and all that kind of stuff. What you're kind of pointing out is possible that we might actually have less of that push to kind of more of the globalized, distributed factory manufacturing systems abroad, supply chains abroad, and more localized. So yeah, it's always funny. Our political debates so often are actually debating something that's increasingly going to be obsolete, or that it's actually going to be superseded by new technologies. But it's an interesting twist that you just mentioned there. One thing that you've alluded to a couple times here, and we should just bring it out on the table, is we've kind of talked up until now, and but going ahead in the next 10 or 20 years, even the next 10 years of new technologies, you mentioned briefly automation. We haven't really talked about AI. What's your attitude of the kind of that overlay now on this future work in terms of adding to the complexity, using that word or frame, or potentially solutions too. But anyhow, just interesting going forward. What's your where do you stand on the kind of the coming transition to AI?
Yeah, sure. And again, I think it sort of hinges well to my introductory remarks with regards to like what are the similarities and what are the differences. And I think the similarity, first and foremost, is around the world, anywhere that I go, you see an enormous amount of interest, not surprisingly. And you see an enormous
Interest
kind of
in AI you're talking about specifically? Okay, yeah,
in
great.
AI, in automation, in technologies that help us meet our needs better. Now, meet our needs better in a sort of individual way, not necessarily thinking about the potential downsides, but there's an enormous amount of interest, enthusiasm, building a better tomorrow, that kind of thing. There's also a very consistent, when I speak particularly to leaders, so CEOs, ministers, the people running a place, if you will, there's a very consistent desire and concern that these new technologies, as we've said before, augment human potential rather than replace it or obliterate it outright. There is a very consistent conversation tone that's around that, because I think a lot of the dis-ease relates to, well, what if something that we've built our economy on just doesn't exist tomorrow? And what's interesting is when you think about, the US has based its economy on services and know-how and this and that, but it's evolved over centuries that way. You have other countries that have really, most of their economy is based on tourism, or most of it's based on manufacturing, or most of it's based on agriculture. All of these different sectors will be disrupted by AI and automation in different ways. So there's a consistency of we think this can be really helpful. We've got to guide it really, really responsibly. We're not sure if people are up to that task, but we're all kind of, I suppose, waking up with a sense of urgency around the same time. Now, in terms of how it plays out differently, again, this goes back to what I was talking about, some of the distinctions at a macro level. The biggest one that I find right now is demographics. So what is the demographic composition of the place we're talking about? And there's no place I can think of that's a better extreme example of this than Japan. Japan is an aging population. Currently today, there are 225 million people roughly in Japan. If all plays out as expected, and there's no famine or war, other things that could happen, but if population sort of plays out as expected, that by 2080, there will be half as many people living in Japan, alive, in Japan as today. And the vast majority of those people will be elderly. So they know already today that there will not be a sufficient workforce to maintain that level of population. Now, how this plays out is it is the one place in the world that I have been where they're like, the robots can't arrive fast enough. Please, we want as many robots as we can have, because that is how we are going to continue to function as a society. Now, that is a wildly, wildly different reality than the vast majority of countries in the world that have actually a youth bulge. They have higher birth rates, and birth rates only play out over the course of decades, So at this point, what happened back in the 1980s is really starting to bear fruit now. And once that train has left the station, it's very hard to rein it back in unless you do something like China did with its one-child policy. Like, they kept their population in. Everywhere else in the world is really having more and more youth. And so if you're concerned about, particularly if you have high unemployment today, and you're looking at a workforce in which it's just going to be more and more youth coming in, you are urgently concerned about how you provide livelihoods to those youth. And so in the face of automation, AI, robotics, you get very, very concerned, because if you haven't been able to employ everyone fully now, and you're expecting a doubling in that workforce, and you don't know where those opportunities to earn income come from, you're really in a tough spot. And I would say that's a far more common reality for countries, and not just developing economies, emerging middle market, frontier markets, sometimes they're called, places like Brazil, Indonesia, Russia to some degree. So there's and these are big countries which collectively do comprise more than half of the global population. And they're all concerned, and not a single one of them has come up with a solution. But we have started looking much more closely at education and, what are the things that are unlikely to be automated soon, and making sure, are we able to train youth for that, and so on and so forth. And by and large, the answer is no, like in terms of educational institutions are woefully prepared for training these skills. But I think people are starting to focus on the same set of issues. And I do think that we will see in more progressive places quite a bit of education reform to match what we see happening in the workforce.
Good. That's very fun. It's very interesting. So we've kind of given your global perspective. This has been good to kind of understand the differentiations and the similarities between these different regions. But let's focus a little bit now on the developed world. One is probably the most advanced in terms of the technology for sure. But actually, Japan is an extreme version of that. But all of Europe is kind of cratering at some level with their populations. And honestly, the U.S., particularly if we slow down immigration, is going to be in a similar situation and others. So there is a kind of, it fits in your logic that actually, from a big picture, long-term perspective, more automation and AI taking over more things is not necessarily a bad thing. I guess it's the transition, though. Well, I would say there's two things. There's how do you transition into that world? And then how do you think differently between jobs as just solving, jobs as livelihood and jobs as actually solving problems that people have to do? And so let's, which kind of gets into policy, which is kind of gets into kind of this other side of your brain, which is you've been doing all this global stuff, and we can kind of see some of that. Let's shift a little bit into policy here. So think about so talk a little bit about for I guess that differentiation. To what extent do you think we have to increasingly think of compensation and supportive livelihood as separate at some level from full employment jobs? You know what I'm saying? Is that on a bigger picture? Isn't that one of the critical leverage pieces here? I guess in some level.
Yeah. So. If I may, just briefly, the transition I'd like to make between where we were and where we're headed,
go ahead.
I really like this, is that the question for me around automation, AI, it's going to be a great thing for many places. My biggest concern is about how is it distributed around the world. So places, developed countries might end up making out great, but the gap between have and have-nots, the gap between developed and developing, the gap between, again, who's going to be just fine and who's going to fall off a cliff. My concern is that we can't forget that. And so we have to think about what does an equitable distribution of this look like? And that may include cross subsidies, that may include rethinking of foreign aid, that may certainly that forces us to rethink both philanthropy and impact investing. And these are things that go beyond the scope of today's conversation. But I think whether you're a Bill Gates or a Rockefeller Foundation, or you're the CEO of a tech company, or you're a policymaker or a mayor or whatever you have, like this is requiring a rethink of all of the different roles that can be played and the investments that can be made as they relate to work and the workforce. Mm-hmm. So now transitioning to the topic of looking at social safety nets, looking at potentially different forms of income, of the difference between livelihood and income generation and all of that. I do think at a basic level, yes, you're right. There is for me, there are at least two layers of what it means to have a livelihood or a job. And I think I have always preferred the term livelihood as a profession, as a vocation, largely because I've spent so much time working in developing and emerging economies where you just didn't talk about jobs. You talked about any ability to earn an income and meet you and your family's needs, and hopefully find some kind of meaning or fulfillment, right? So we can say jobs, we can say livelihoods. I think jobs ends up being a bit more orthodox in that it typically means you're an employee with an employer and a contract and all of that. But nonetheless, when we look at livelihoods, it's at least two things. One is the ability to earn income and the ability to buy things in the economy and pay for your things and your family's needs and all of that. And the other piece, though, is something related to dignity, meaning, purpose, like why are we here? And people want to feel like they're contributing something to society. They want to feel like they belong to part of a bigger community. They want to feel as though they matter and that the planet is a better place because they're here. Now, what you find really interesting is when you survey people who do long-term, deep volunteer work, they have immense meaning, but they're not earning income for that. Now, as we look forward to different kinds of income substitution, income support, so on and so forth, for me, it's helpful to distinguish between those two things because, and not that we need to analyze them separately, but it's almost as though the economists are so focused on things like universal basic income, except like the technical, how are you going to meet your needs, which admittedly is super, super important. But we can't forget how will people continue to find meaning and purpose in their lives. And what you find are people, to find that, it's not that people who earn more money find more meaning. What you find is it's often some kind of the opposite. But so universal basic income, tools like that can start helping to tackle the former, but not the latter. And I feel like the latter is actually an area that's really rich and robust. We start getting into how do we keep communities more connected and engaged. Lots of policies that we could put into place there that actually don't cost very much money. So I'm not sure if we want to dive into one or the other of those first. I mean, universal basic income, I know, is a popular topic.
No, we could. I mean, without, I don't think. 'Cause I think what's great about your perspective is kind of the overview, so we don't have to go deep into any of them, honestly. But yes, because we've done some work on the universal basic income. So there's one level of just how do we actually just lower people's anxiety around the transition. I guess at some level is really tied to income at some level.
Yeah.
But I agree that there's this other side of meaning. Like even if you did have, everyone just living fat and happy and doing nothing, that wouldn't really be a good society either. So I get at the bigger level there. I guess what we're trying to do here is think, maybe think of it this way. What's the strategy or the ways to start about thinking about a strategy for people in public policy to start dealing with this new future is another way maybe to think about it. As opposed to freaking out and just, or trying to hold back the tides of change and just, let's go back to make America great again the old way. How would you start advising people like that? So I was just trying to start down that path. Okay, how do you support people? How do you make people meaningful life? I mean, boom, there's different things, but then I think let's think bigger picture, but then also get more granular on some ideas of you could even start relatively soon here.
Yeah, and the timing of this call could not be better, actually, because just last Thursday, from a global perspective, just last Thursday, the UK government published the first report of its kind in the world. It's called the Taylor Report on the Future Workplace. It is the first time that any major government has actually invested, and they invested quite a bit of time, resources, expertise in developing their basically point of view and strategy around how we're going to tackle this space. So I hesitate to say that, as I work in the policy reform space, broadly speaking, I always like to say, like, the first step is education, research, just like make sure we know what we're looking at. That is the space that the overwhelming majority of places around the world are still in. Now, from there, from education and research, then you start looking at the next step is typically pilots, partnerships, put some things out there, see what works, what doesn't. And only at the very end do you find legislative reform. Legislative and policy reform really should be and is a last step in most cases, because when you put something into law, when you make it a rule, it needs to symbolize something that you've learned actually works. So it's much less today about, oh, we've passed a new law, and much more about, do we actually understand what's going on? And so the Taylor review does exactly that. But it's one of the boldest that I've seen. And I think one of the things that it's getting a lot of press for at the moment is it's the first official report to say the government needs, in effect, I'm paraphrasing here, the government needs to redefine a certain class of worker as dependent contractors. So they're actually saying we need a new worker classification. Now, we both know that this has been debated for quite a while, and it's not sure that it's certainly not a silver bullet. Would it accomplish the goals, et cetera, et cetera? But they're putting a stake in the ground and they're saying, we think this classification needs to exist. We're going to be investing more in it, defining it, and we're going to try to the extent possible to fit, and I don't want to say retrofit, but we're going to try to blend it with current workplace practices. And where gaps exist, then we will be looking at how do we develop a separate set of rules to meet the needs of dependent contractors. And so, I guess as I like to frame it often, it's if something's not broken, don't fix it. And insofar as we can learn from what's worked well about social safety nets in other contexts, and realizing that it's not about having an employee-employer straitjacket, but that there are certain aspects of benefits provided to employees that would be beneficial to dependent contractors, you can legislate around that and kind of come to a sort of compromise or a middle path whereby you're not providing all of the same benefits that an employee would get because you're not reaching that level of commitment or loyalty or time spent at one particular company, but you are starting to get at, again, a blended path, a middle road, a compromise that's better than what's there today. Because I definitely think that we're not going to find a kind of binary black and white, break everything and put in place a new model tomorrow. I think this is going to be a transition in which we try to find that middle path that more accurately and effectively and efficiently meets the needs of independent workers, in this case in the UK, calling them dependent contractors.
Okay, so that's what I was going to clarify. So dependent contractors is
so
essentially independent workers in the way we were talking about in this series. But why do they call it dependent? Explain that word.
And we have that concept here in the US as well. Again, it's more at this point in my experience, it's more of a term of art to define it as different than an independent contractor. So what we're looking at here, and again, I know that we're focused quite a bit on the self-employed as a whole. So the dependent contractor concept is not all of self-employment by any stretch, but particularly looking at technology-enabled companies. So you've got a platform with drivers, with different kinds of experts, with different people with different kinds of skills, who are typically, historically, you're either an employee or an independent contractor. So in this case, they're all independent contractors. But when you look at how much they're working, and you look at how much, you kind of run through the test of what typically defines an independent contractor. And independent contractors typically, completely set their own hours. They work for multiple companies at once. They have total freedom and flexibility about what they do, how much they charge, et cetera, et cetera. You start realizing that some of these so-called independent contractors, they're not employees. It would be very hard to make a bona fide case that they're employees, but they're definitely something more than an independent contractor. And
for example, just to be clarified, they spend most of their time working for the same
working for one or two platforms.
And those platforms are telling them when to do it, or at least within some
they're
constraints.
Controlling how much they earn, all of that. Yeah. I mean, and in this case, in fairness, drivers are the easiest example to look at, but I really don't want to limit ourselves to drivers, because you can think about delivery companies, you can think about various kinds of on-demand skills, and typically not white collar skills. Like when you have a kind of expertise that's really hard to find, then you generally find you're better able to negotiate what you charge. But when you talk about, it could be a handyman, it could be a dog walker, it could be like stuff that more fungible skills, you find that people are offering their services up and they have less and less control over what they earn, which is a hallmark of not being a truly independent contractor. So going back to the UK government, though, what I want to make clear here is they're not saying that they have the definition today. But what they're saying is we need to develop this, we need to prioritize it, we need to invest in it, and this is going to be one of the backbones of our future economy, but also our future labor and employment policy. And that's an important signal, and it's something I hate to say here in the US, they're light years ahead of where we are simply by taking this step.
So going back to your bigger frame there is a research phase, an understanding phase, which honestly this part of this project is to help figure that out as well. But we're also, I think, in the policy innovation space, or I guess exactly how you classify that, huh?
Yeah.
The pilot
Pilot.
group. So tell us about some ideas that you might have that would be, and let's think about the United States here as an example, as a concrete place that we're both in right here on the West Coast, right this minute, since that's where we are. What are some ideas that you could encourage folks to start thinking about, if they're mayors or city councils or state legislators or however you want to think about it? What are the ways that we could start moving into that space from the research and world that we're still kind of wrestling with?
Yeah, so there are many that come to mind. I think I'll focus on two.
Okay.
Today, just because they're kind of front and central, and they're starting to get some conversation in various corners here in the U.S. and some places elsewhere in the world. The first one relates more broadly to benefits, and it has to do, and apologies if I'm oversimplifying or glossing over anything, but it does relate to this concept of a dependent contractor or somebody who works for multiple platforms, not 20 different platforms, but they've got a gig here, they've got a gig there, they've got their own thing, they've got a few different things going on, none of which is a full-time job, but all of which are necessary to make their ends meet, and all of which bring them some kind of income and fulfillment. Typically, we've had the sole employer pay 100% of all benefits. This is sort of, there's a trade-off. You traded as an employee, you traded your flexibility, you signed away your life and, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 and overtime and all the rest to one person. So you signed away your flexibility, but you got stability. So now, and as an independent worker, you signed away your stability, but you got a lot of flexibility. It is very easy for me to imagine, both in terms of the concept as well as the rules we would need to put in place, to imagine developing a system of benefits whereby, let's say you work for 4 different platforms on, to make things simple, roughly equal bases. Each one of them is responsible for contributing 25% of your benefits pool to a common pool that is then tapped into by all dependent contractors who are working for that particular platform. That's not rocket science to figure out. But we've put ourselves in this kind of, again, binary black and white, it's all or nothing situation. And so this is one of those things where a question I have, a lot of companies in this space are really, really keen to do more for their workforce, but they're stuck, again, in this straitjacket of either being seen as an employer, which triggers all sorts of challenges and responsibilities that they're not up for, or being seen as completely checked out and not caring at all for their workforce. This is one of those things, question I have, and again, I have not done all of the legal research on this, but you could imagine pilots happening certainly between municipal governments and the companies that operate there. You could also imagine pilots being done by companies themselves. It's not that this is a legislatively heavy kind of thing. It basically requires forward-thinking companies to say, we want to be a kind of corporate citizen that this place needs. Now, if you're a mayor, what you want to do, I think, is sit down with the companies operating in this space, operating in your city, and ask them about what kinds of pilots and partnerships along these lines you could come up with. It could be contributing to what we might think of, what many countries call a provident fund, which is basically a general insurance pool. You could think of it as insurance, you could think of it as disability, a common pool whereby the companies contribute pro rata based on the number of workers and the number of hours and that sort of thing. And it starts getting us away from this all or nothing and gives us a sandbox to play in the middle. So that's one.
Just a couple questions. So before you shift to the second one, what what level of government is that level? I mean, you mentioned mayors, but it seems to me that they would get in trouble with the state, classification issues as well in trying that. I mean, so for example, whether would they be triggering
No,
issues
I
with
get
the
it.
state from where they're classifying those workers? And I guess what I'm just trying to figure out is how do you actually coordinate or find the right level of government, or is there some way or do you have to have everyone buy into it? I'm just curious how you think about that.
I get it. I totally get it. And this is where my my legal training comes back in, because keep in mind too, I know we're talking about the US, but depending on the country that you are in the world, everywhere is structured differently. But it's some combination of local, municipal level, regional level, maybe it's a state, maybe it's a province, national level, and then to make things really complex, you have supranational like the European Union, where they actually have to harmonize the rules and regulations of 28 different countries, which is no small feat. So in this particular case, and I'm intentionally keeping things fairly big
Yeah.
picture today,
Hmm.
because if we go too far in the weeds, we'll get lost. As well as I think anyone listening.
Hmm.
But for example, if we talk about insurance, generally speaking, insurance in the US is set at the state level. But if we talk about things like minimum wage, that's usually set at a city level. These are both issues that come to play, that come to the fore for some of these new economy companies. One thing, and I think the need and the opportunity for mayors to network with one another cannot be underestimated. And I know that they're starting to do that in many different fora, but this is where if you have a state level issue, for example, and you have the mayors of the major cities in a state able to actually say, we would all really like to pilot this thing. You take it to the state and you actually have a bit more of a collective force. Now, I think that there are things on the minimum wage end of things, for example, or looking at universal basic income, minimum wages, things in that space that are 100% feasible to pilot at a local level. When it comes to things like a legal obligation to provide insurance, you probably are looking at something that will require some kind of state involvement. But there, candidly, in my experience, governors are not any better equipped to deal with some of this stuff. They are hungry. They are searching for solutions. And if you bring the leaders of the major cities in your state to the state capital and say, we have a potential solution, the state, it's not that they will be automatically enthusiastic, but this is a case in which interests are aligned, in which, the state is responsible for getting the insurance. They don't have the solutions. They're looking for more local stakeholders to give them some guidance and direction. And so it would be then, in that case, it would be a multi-city pilot, a multi-city solution, which if it goes well, could be spread out statewide.
Gotcha. Okay, how about that second one then? Let's move to that one.
Yeah, so the second one has to do with more broadly, when I think about what do we need for a future of work and a future for independent workers in particular that allows them to thrive. And we're looking at social safety nets and a whole range of benefits. We're also, though, looking at support services. Is where you work, do they make it easy for you to conduct business? Now, historically, we've always had this index called ease of doing business. And, you have international rankings, and basically multinationals choose to relocate or establish a headquarter in a place that typically has a very high ease of doing business score, right? So it's that kind of thinking. What would it mean to, on the one hand, develop a ranking or an index or a series of measurements whereby cities simply test themselves? Are we an easy place for independent workers to do business? When it comes to things like registering your business, when it comes to things like paying taxes, when it comes to things like having financial services providers, that customize their financial services for independent workers. All of those sorts of things, which are about creating an enabling environment for independent workers to thrive. Now, that is hyper local. That is something that, in my opinion, cities should start competing on. This is something that requires very little, if any, legislative reform. I'm thinking about one great example is New York City, which back in May passed what they call the Freelance Isn't Free Act, which is local legislation that gives greater protection to independent workers to be paid on time, to have, recourse if they are injured on the job. Very basic sorts of things, but it's the kind of thing that also shows that New York City gets what it means to be an independent worker and is trying to make some steps to be an easier place to be an independent worker. So that's one layer of providing support services so that independent workers not only want to work there, but can be really productive in your city. It's related to city marketing and branding. It's related to talent attraction and retention. It's related to a lot of the things that mayors are most concerned about getting right as we look at the coming years. Now, there's another layer to this that I'll just put out there very briefly, which goes more to, and again, it all can be done at the city or in some cases state or region level, depending. But it relates to the business model itself. How do we create tech-enabled businesses that are more equitable, that allow more people to benefit in the upside, et cetera, et cetera. And you might have heard about this concept called the platform cooperative, which is a legal structure, kind of like you would establish an S Corp or a C Corp or an LLC. Think of it like that. So you would need legislation that allows this thing to exist. But basically
so it doesn't exist in the United States? Because I know I've talked to some Europeans, they do this in Europe.
The cooperative model absolutely exists. But what you would be looking to do in this case is add a level of digital intelligence to it, so to speak. We've always had cooperatives. Cooperatives, if you look historically, they're one of the most resilient corporate forms in existence. They historically have not been very easy to maintain or to govern because, when you have a cooperative and everyone has a share and a vote and a this and a that, it breaks down. Oftentimes corporate governance has been quite tricky given the hyper egalitarian nature of the cooperatives. New technologies, particularly those that are enabled by blockchain, but even without the blockchain, technologies that allow cooperative members to participate through the platform actually reduce a lot of that friction that has held up cooperatives in the past. So again, it sounds like you've heard this too, where whether it's a driver-owned ride-sharing platform or there are actually a couple of examples already in existence. One's called Stocksy, which is actually a platform for photographers, freelance photographers, but they all own the company. And again, they're all freelance photographers. They're all, some of them provide on-demand services. Some of them are just independent. They're freelancers, but they all contribute their photos to the platform, but they all own a share of it. So they're benefiting in the upside as well as a bit buffered in any downside. So going back to one of my recommendations, which is take this platform cooperative model and its potential really seriously. It's not that you would force any entrepreneur to become a platform cooperative, but to offer it as one way of incorporating and providing your services as an independent worker. It tends to be certainly much more egalitarian, much more equitable. It also allows you to buffer yourself against some of the risks because cooperatives are able to provide some of the social safety net services to their members that we find lacking in the mainstream economy today. So that's another area where if I'm a mayor, I want to attract that kind of company to my city. I want to make it easy for them to incorporate. I want to better understand how they operate and how they might help other people in my city get involved and that sort of thing. And to be really clear, I am not saying that this is at the exclusion of any other for-profit or nonprofit model. I'm saying we need to have this as an option on the menu because there are a lot of people, both employees or workers, as well as entrepreneurs who want to build business in this way. And it's really, really hard for them to do so in a way that's seen as socially acceptable today.
We're kind of getting to the end of the hour here, so unfortunately, we can't keep going too much deeper into the policy ideas. Although, for those that are watching, we are going to actually be doing some virtual roundtables, and there's going to be one on, in fact, policy innovations that we might build off some of these ideas that April's thrown out here. But anyhow, as we're kind of wrapping up here, we've kind of been doing a big picture on the global trends and how that differentiates. We've looked into kind of where could you go in the policy implications to kind of make this better. But in the next 5 years or so, there's a lot of feeling like something, a lot of things are going to happen relatively quickly or need to happen relatively quickly. Is there any last thoughts you'd have on like places you'd kind of have people focus on and look to in this space to kind of that are promising ways to kind of make things better or things to worry about for that matter and keep an eye on? Any last thoughts on that?
You bet. So I think at a very, very meta level, I continue to believe that with a few exceptions, we are going to continue to see the most interesting stuff happen at the city level, at the local level, with not a ton of national, there will be reports written at the national level. There may be some policy designs developed, but I think that where the rubber hits the road is going to be in our cities and in our communities. When it comes to things like the platform cooperatives that we were talking briefly about, Spain is, in my experience, the leader in looking at what an entire economy built with a cooperative mindset in mind would look like. They both have a lot of digitally enabled cooperatives, but they also have this cooperative called Mondragon. It's the largest cooperative in the world. It employs over 300,000 people. They're not independent workers, they're full-blown employees, but they're actually one of the largest companies in the whole country. So that's a really interesting test bed or test case for me. I think a couple things that we haven't talked a lot about, including where I would look for what's happening. As we think about the growing number of independent workers and how to help make their voices known and advocate for their needs, the role of labor unions should not be discounted. Labor unions are not particularly strong in the US. They are very strong in many other places around the world. And they have a lot of sway. And historically, they've represented typically workers, employees. There is a huge opportunity for labor unions to expand their area of representation, to look at independent workers as well. We are starting to see a little bit of this happen, particularly in the Nordics. So I would say Sweden, Finland, Denmark, to a lesser degree, Norway. These are countries that have always had incredibly tight integration of companies, employers, government, tax authorities, and so forth. Labor unions have always played a really, really strong role, and they're concerned that in this new world of work, they might become obsolete. So they're actually fighting to keep their place at the table, and they're being forced in a way to innovate in order to continue to show their relevance. And while they have been relatively more important in this region, I think the insights we can draw from them are universal to some degree for everywhere in the world. And just because we haven't had historically super strong labor unions here in the US, and yes, we do have organizations like the Freelancers Union today, I think that is potentially but the tip of the spear in terms of the ability and need for independent workers to organize. And it doesn't have to be organizing for policy advocacy necessarily. It can also be organizing to help one another. It can be organizing to find more work opportunities. It can be organizing for a lot of different collective, cooperative, and business development reasons. But that is an area where I think we can learn from Europe. And I think we do need to add more local flavor here in the US and around the world. So those are a couple of closing thoughts. I
Mhm.
know we could talk about this for
We
quite a
could
while.
we
But
could go for a long while. Although I will just say about the labor unions, I mean, they've also been associated with being more conservative players in any kind of economic changes and technological changes. So although you have some belief in that it could be add to the problem, or I add to
well,
the solution. There's been I know in the tech community there's been a kind of a feeling like they tend to actually resist a lot of these things in ways that are not that helpful often.
for sure. And I want to be clear here. And apologies if I glossed over that. I'm looking at what does a 21st century labor union look like. I don't even know that we call it a labor union, but I definitely think one of the biggest challenges in this space is that independent workers, by and large, including the self-employed as a whole, don't identify in the same way or as part of a bigger thing. And as a result, it ends up being quite fragmented and disaggregated when it comes to advocating for their needs or feeling like, where do they go to get that bigger voice? I think that what the kind of union or the kind of entity I'd be looking at would be to give voice to exactly the folks that are, I guess many would say, the disruptors, but whose workers or whose labor force still ends up being stuck in an antiquated system. So yeah, the traditional guys, not really, although the traditional guys, they are starting to realize that if they don't adapt, they will be obsolete. So that's a little bit of a nudge. But more than that, I think I'm not sure whether or not we will, if we were to look back 50 years from now, will we see old school or traditional labor unions successfully being able to adapt and lead the path forward? Or will we see the emergence of, I suppose, I don't want to say grassroots, but more bottom up, new movements, new platforms, new vehicles, entities, organizations to represent new economy worker interests? I don't know. It might be a combination.
It'd be interesting. Well, we'll see as we track this story in the coming years here. But it's been terrific having April here. As always, she brings a global perspective I think is often needed, particularly when you see things from the United States' kind of lens. And also kind of some interesting policy innovations that we're going to hopefully build on actually in this series. So thanks so much, April, for coming in, and hope to see you again
My pleasure, Pete. Thank you
soon.
very much.
All right. See you.